Griff was fat in those days, which was marvellous. But since he's got so skinny and looks so terribly dashing, I've gone off him, to be quite honest.
Bastard! We're peculiar because we're quite different people in some ways, but we had a similar sense of humour, which I'm sure helps in any marriage.
Have you been upset then or something?
I've been going through a very miserable and very expensive time.
Have you? What, you've renewed your Arsenal season ticket again?
They were a modern double act, and they weren't a sort of cannon and ball double act. They were a highly intelligent, cutting-edge double act that went into the mainstream.
We love to sit in a pile of poodle.
I put them in the top 1,000 TV shows ever.
You probably noticed there's been a whole rash of these programmes, these sort of connections-type programmes recently.
No, I think this is because the public love to see how their favourite comedy programmes were made by an incestuous in-crowd glad handing each other up the greasy pole.
Thanks, Griff. And here's how they did it. Over nearly 15 years and more than 70 episodes on BBC One, BBC Two and ITV, Mel Smith and Griff Rhys-Jones were a cornerstone of TV sketch comedy. Thrown together in the groundbreaking Not the 9 O'Clock News, Mel and Griff emerged as a mainstream double act with a subversive edge. But each started out on a different career path. Mel was a theatre director and Griff followed Route 1 from Cambridge to BBC Radio. Like Griff, fellow students and future Smith & Jones writers, Clive Anderson, Jimmy Mulville and Rory McGrath, knew what they'd gone to university for: to show off in the Cambridge Footlights Review.
I dream of entering her chamber dim, slipping naked into her bed.
And showing off's exactly what they did.
I met Griff at Cambridge in the Footlights, which is where all comedians go to meet each other for later TV series and TV and radio work.
By contrast, Mel Smith, a salt-of-the-earth type son of a bookie, was not of the Cambridge University elite. He went to Oxford.
I just sort of used to tit about in the Oxford Review, which wasn't quite the same thing. And we generally regarded ourselves as rather third-rate in comparison to the Footlights.
Smith & Jones's first meeting was memorable. Well, for Mel, at least.
I remember we were doing a sort of Oxford and Cambridge drink thing, and he was a really bizarre-looking geezer. Actually, he looked like a cross between Tommy Cooper and Donovan. I think he thought he looked like Mark Bolan, but I'm telling you, it was Donovan. But then, of course, we were thrown together really by Not the 9 O'Clock News.
Griff Rhys-Jones was plucked from the ranks of radio producers as backup to the original Not the 9 O'Clock News cast of Rowan Atkinson, Pamela Stephenson, Chris Langham and Mel Smith, put together for BBC Two by producer John Lloyd in 1979. Behind the scenes, Clive Anderson and Rory McGrath were part of a team delivering sketches that were a blast of fresh air in British comedy. From Not the 9 O'Clock News, Smith & Jones were to develop a lasting bond with these writers, but most of all, with each other.
I think they've suggested it was because they were slightly overshadowed in Not the 9 O'Clock News by Rowan, who is this extraordinary comic genius, and Pamela Stephenson, who's, apart from anything else, very, very female, very easy on the eye and very interesting, and they were kind of slightly in the shadows. That drew them together.
American Express?
That'll do nicely, sir. And would you like to rub my tits too?
What used to happen is Mel and I used to sit in the corner together of a studio watching the extraordinary fuss that was made over Pamela.
And we found that we liked writing together and we liked performing together and we made each other laugh. And so we became a little unit all of our own.
Very different characters, physically and sort of personally very different. You know, Mel, big sort of Dickens sort of, how do you put it, sort of avuncular, sort of rotund, sort of cuddly, chuckly figure, and Griff a rather more sort of paranoid, neurotic, gibbering idiot.
So, Not the 9 O'Clock News finished rather precipitately. And it was an odd thing for me because I was sort of like a professional. I'd been in this machine, really, in the comedy machine for some time.
When Not the 9 O'Clock News was finished, we we sort of clutched onto each other for warmth and decided, I think, that if we were going to have any further career in the business, we'd better sort of try doing it together, at least begin with, you know.
Mel and Griff's work in Not the 9 O'Clock News was enough for Head of Light Entertainment John Howard Davies to feature them in The Funny Side of Christmas, a one-off special in 1982. The seed of Alas, Smith and Jones was sown in a show celebrating the best of British comedy.
It would be pompous of me to say that I had anything to do with their partnership. All I did was realise it was happening and take advantage of it.
Merry Boxing Day to you.
It was pretty evident that they could go further, but it wasn't until they did a little sketch in a Christmas show that I decided to commission a pilot.
John Howard Davies and John Lloyd and everybody sort of said, look, why don't you carry on and do your own thing, because you're forming a very good partnership. And so we just thought, well, hell, why not?
Who the hell are you? What are you doing in my surgery?
Dr. Jekyll, I'm very worried about the prescription you've been giving me.
Despite rough edges, the pilot was thought strong enough to go to series. Fresh from working on Blackadder, director Martin Shardlow was brought in to help shape the new show.
I think because it was being approached as a sort of two-man comedy duo, which, although it was, it didn't really work that way. It needed a different format. And that was the big problem, trying to come up with a different format for it.
We didn't really have much in the way of a very specific plan. It was going to be a sketch show. It was going to be make things that made us laugh, sometimes a bit wacky, sometimes a bit more extended, perhaps, than the 9 o'clock news stuff.
Alas, Smith and Jones made its BBC Two debut in January 1984 and introduced a new variation on Morecambe and Wise.
Look, somebody up there shouted, "Come on, Watford."
There was some intro stuff which we wanted to do, just get the show moving. And then there was stuff which we would call stool stuff, which was just the two of us sitting there as ourselves, with me essentially playing usually a slightly haughty, neurotic type, as it were, and Mel playing a much more down-to-earth, sort of arse-scratching, sort of straightforward football watching bloke.
I mean, there's nothing to be ashamed about in being working class. I am not ashamed. All right, OK. I'm just not working class. All right, OK, fine. Fine. All right. Right. You look working class.
People knew Mel and Griff from Not the 9 O'Clock News, and they were likeable characters in their own right. And the fact that they'd got together to do a show, I think, interested the audience. And once they'd seen them doing things that were slightly different and working together as well at the openings and closings, it was a format that they liked.
You look a bit, coarse at the edges. I mean, in the nicest possible way. You look a bit Neanderthal. Piss off!
They had a great relationship because they got on, on screen and off screen. So they were easy to write for in a way because on Smith and Jones, you did sketches in which they played themselves, or sort of a refined form of themselves.
This is very working class behaviour now, you see.
Like Rory, many of the show's writers knew Mel and Griff well, having followed them from university by way of BBC Radio and Not the 9 O'Clock News, to gather again at Alas, Smith and Jones.
Script meetings were usually Griff and Mel at one end of the big long table and all the keen writers down the sides, and me and Clive and Jimmy, the naughty boys who've known Griff a long time, at the back, sort of sniggering and throwing paper darts and getting a hip flasks out.
And the way we worked was very similar to the way that we worked on Not the 9 O'Clock News. We'd gather together a massive script, look through, find out what we found was funny, or we thought were amusing ideas, and which we wanted to develop. Some very rarely, unfortunately, do scripts, especially in the freelance world, appear in a sort of pristine, brilliant form.
We just basically would play around with it during the course of the week, knock it about, hopefully come up with even better lines and just sort of give it a sort of a rhythm a shape that felt as natural as possible.
Mel was always the one that was sort of laid back, puff on the cigar, flicking through, going, ah, ah, so you knew, that was in. And Griff would be the other end, and he'd be going, nope, over the shoulder. What's this? Nope.
Stack to his feet and pace up and down. And the note he'd be giving about this sketch is he'd say, well, look, it needs to go bonkety, bonkety, bonk. You think, well, I know what you mean in terms of the rhythm, but what is bonkety, bonkety, bonk? And we had to supply what bonkety, bonkety, bonk was.
I'm a bit of an angling freak, Last week I broke the British pollock record, caught an absolute beauty off Newhaven. So I thought, I think I'll have a pair of pollocks tattooed on my back.
Not content to star in the show, Griff wanted to write it too.
Books. I wrote massive chunks of it myself, but I always followed the system of throwing, rather scared of trying to force my writing. I never felt of myself really as being much of a comedy writer, so I would always try and introduce it, Gerald Wiley-like Ronnie Barker, into the pile without sort of necessarily drawing. And then when people read it, they'd look up and see me, sitting very tense in the corner, chewing and looking at them. And they'd, obviously, it was helped by the fact that it had Griff Rhys-Jones written all over the top of it, but obviously I always hoped that they'd take an objective sort of view of these sketches and then include them if they were funny and not if they weren't.
He did initiate a hell of a lot of the sketches, and then that would form a discussion, and if somebody was particularly keen or somebody actually input a lot into the discussion, they'd say, well, look, why don't you go away and do that, or why don't I go and do that, because that's the sort of area I'd like to do. And then you'd write it up and give it to Griff, and Griff would fuck it up. No, Griff would change it and improve it even more than it, make it funny even than it was already, and it would go out.
Griff would be at the coalface all day and working with the writers, and then Mel would sort of sweep in and say, how's everybody? Hello, everybody. Fantastic. This is all great stuff. Lunch? And we'd all love, we'd all, yeah.
There were some new faces at those lunches too. Robin Driscoll and his Cliffhanger Theatre Group had made a big impression on Mel Smith. As a result, the writer's surreal sketches regularly made it onto the show. And Robin did too, in the guise of the tongue-tied boxer.
Frankie! Stuff to Frankie.
The thing that always interested me the most in comedy was the visual and the odd, the slightly surreal. And those were the ones that I managed to sneak through. One that comes to mind would be The Boxer.
And all that and everything else, and everything that goes with it, and all that and everything, and, which I think was fantastic.
Submit it up, Charlie. I mean, like with a bastard ton up front like that, and everything else that goes with it, and all that stuff, and that, and all that, and that, and that, and that. It's just math, it's always just math, and everything like that, and like that, and everything like that, which goes with it, and everything like that.
That was a very funny script to look at when it arrived on the desk, I can tell you. What the hell's this?
We'd look at the page and it was, you were sort of, it's like, and and it was sort of, in it, and it's, what's this? What is this?
It's like, what you say, it's like, it's sort of like, if we're like, Saturn sometimes, sort of thing.
Yeah, right.
Bless them, they really worked hard, and right up until the recording of that, Griff was unsure. And it wasn't until, there was an audience that actually laughed at it that Griff got it, and he did a great performance on that one.
So what with a ton up front and everything like that, and so what, and, everything never too unknown to man, eh? I mean, it's got a point, I think, that's what's worth it, because, like, sometimes... fish in a sea, sort of.
Right, fish, yeah. Maybe...
Once the surreal boxer sketch got past the Smith & Jones quality control, the writers knew they could try just about anything.
There was a great feeling of liberation because, basically, we knew that Griff and Mel would do they would play any part. They would play a Dalek, a US president, a tea leaf. They were happy to play, if the sketch was funny.
Unusually for a comedy double act, there was no straight man. Both were keen to act the fool. But when the chance came to wear a frock, there was only one man for the job.
keep quiet about it.
The great thing about Griff was that, for us as writers, was how do you get Griff interested in an idea? Dress him up. Give him a funny hat, funny costume, dress him up in bondage, and you knew it'd get past. You know, it wasn't going to go, nope. Bondage.
Ladies and gentlemen, slight awkwardness tonight. Griff, for some reason, hasn't actually turned up. I don't quite know... Oh, he's here.
Griff's always been very game about this kind of thing. There is something of the pantomime dame about Griff, and his willingness to put a dress on. I was always very, very impressed by it. He never thought twice, you know. Beginning of the week, if we were saying, right, we're going to do Meatloaf, obviously I'm going to play Meatloaf. Who's going to play Cher? And Griff said, yep, no problem. You know, in fact, he was a little too keen, to be quite honest, I think.
Till when?
Till about 10 past, gonna make you squeal, gonna make you scream.
Some said Mel's roles were easily definable, Mel being one of them.
You look very carefully through the whole series. I think there's about 3 characters I do. And then, of course, I do those 3 characters, but with or without glasses. So that's 6 characters I've got. And with or without moustache is 9. So, in fact, I've got quite a range of characters I can play.
Praise be the Lord. How's the vow of silence, Monsignor? Give us a song.
In 1981, Mel and Griff had formed a company, Talkback, and created a highly distinctive brand of radio commercials. Just 2 blokes chatting. For Alas, Smith and Jones, they took from Not the 9 O'Clock News the pattern of comedy sketches, studio discussion and song and dance routines. But it was their Talkback radio adverts that inspired the famous head-to-heads.
I think it was Griff's idea, but he was quite right. That actually we wanted to try and find a way of taking this very simple form, which would work great for us on radio commercials, where we just sort of like quite loose and, you know, you'd have a bit of script and you'd play around with it and it would feel very, very natural. And we both realised we wanted to get that element into the programme. And I think it was Griff who said, well, why don't we just sort of exactly do what it is, which is just sit there and do it, like we do when we're in a studio together.
The very first episode of Alas, Smith and Jones took the issue of sperm donation, tackled it head-on, and a format was born.
I'll go down there quite often, actually. Do you? Yeah, to the artificial inseminatory sperm bank, you know.
The idea was these 2 guys were in cubicles next to each other, having this conversation. In the cubicles, trying to produce the sample of sperm by wanking. Just in case you weren't familiar with that process. And Chris said, all right, get rid of the set, Let's just deconstruct the whole thing.
We took the idea of the radio commercials and simply took the microphone, which is hanging between us, and raised the microphone out of the way and sat there and did the head-to-head entirely like that.
I found myself writing almost exclusively the head-to-head. I was the head-to-head writer when their first few series.
I mean, there's a lot of women in the world. Right?
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And a lot of them for various reasons.
Yeah.
They can't get pregnant.
No.
See, because their husbands haven't got it in them. See.
What, not at all.
Well, not as much as I have.
No.
It's a Dumb and Dumber sort of format. It's the stupid man talking to an even more stupid friend. And the stupid one's got pretensions or has ideas, as it were, above his station. And the other one is by being even more stupid, sort of pricks the pomposity.
You know that new lavatory I had installed?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I've had to send it back.
Oh, what was that?
I had a chip in it. Oh. You could have flushed that away, I'd have thought.
I think some of our best acting our best performances are in that, because we spent a lot of time working our way through that and then retaining, which is great, which Mel was always very good with, a sort of sense of improvisation, because you never knew where the audience were going to take you.
There's quite a lot of pressure on it, actually. I don't want to overdo it, obviously. I'm hardly suggesting that we were very brave. You know, the idea of very brave. Not really. But it was quite tense making, because you knew that you had to get to the end, and you knew that somehow you had to hold it together between you, you know.
I'm having this terrible recurring nightmare.
What is it?
'It's a dream what comes over and over again.
I know that, obviously I know that. I know.
5 million BBC Two viewers regularly watched their relationship develop over the first few series. But what looked natural on screen was hardly stress-free off it.
Griff was a great studier. He would have to go home at night and actually really, really learn. And I was always quite lucky. I just was very, very lucky. I had a sort of very retentive memory, so I could get away with pretty much not doing any special learning and kind of more or less do it.
Mel is extraordinary in as much as he never, ever seems to learn any of the lines until 20 seconds before he appears in front of the camera, which is slightly disturbing.
Which made me feel, of course, infinitely superior to Griff. And he would come in all tense and worried, and I'd sort of swan in half an hour later on a Sunday, sort of going, "Everything all right, love? How's it going?" You know, with him going,
There were minor elements of Mel's behavioural patterns, which sometimes I would find a little bit complicated, and there were many, many in mine that he undoubtedly had to keep under control, his reactions to the various things.
So obviously it hasn't always been a bed of roses. No, it hasn't. No.
Griff would say to me, "You tell Mel Smith he better be at rehearsals at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning." And Mel would say, "You can tell Griff that I've got something better to do and I'll turn up at noon." And this was my role, to shuffle between the two. And Griff at times would complain that he was like the little wife at home getting dinner ready, i.e. writing the scripts, preparing the scripts. And Mel would then sort of swan in and say, you know, "Oh, the script's on the table." And that was the nature of their relationship, but actually always with good humour. And although they would moan a little bit about each other, they got on.
You wanted to see me, sir? No, especially. I want results, and I want results now. Righto, sir.
Arsenal 2,
Chelsea 1,
Everton 3.
Shut up.
By 1987, Alas, Smith and Jones was a bona fide success. With appreciative audiences and big ratings, the BBC commissioners loved Mel and Griff, and they loved the BBC back. But something possessed them to cross the river to London Weekend Television and make their next series for the opposition.
We got approached by ITV, actually, who said that you could be the new face of Saturday Night on ITV. A frightening prospect, I think, at that stage.
Good evening, welcome to this, the first programme in a new and very exciting series.
Well, it was different. I mean, it was different. It was like leaving home. It was like sort of doing something. It was like going on tour. You'd suddenly find yourself at LWT, and it wasn't the same. There wasn't the same kind of depth of backup. And I think also we were just used to working at the Beeb.
But The World According To was just one of several projects Mel and Griff had on the go. While working on Alas, Smith and Jones, they also co-wrote and starred in the sci-fi spoof Morons from Outer Space. And in 1987, Griff was cast as Cornelius Carrington in Porterhouse Blue.
I'm told by those who know about these things you've made some name for yourself in the entertainment industry.
Not entertainment. I consider myself a maker of opinion.
Meanwhile, Mel Smith starred in 2 series of the sitcom Colin's Sandwich. In 1989, he resumed his directing career, this time in movies. Written by Richard Curtis, The Tall Guy starred Jeff Goldblum and Emma Thompson and proved memorable for Mel.
When I told Emma and Jeff that I wanted them to get their kit off, what I didn't say was, you know, that as long as it's as long as it seems appropriate for the, you know, for the art that we're doing. Basically, because I think we can do lots of funny stuff. And they both said, well, yeah, OK, that's fair enough. As long as it is funny, then we don't mind.
After The Tall Guy, Mel and Griff were eager to resume their partnership and return to the warm embrace of the BBC. By now, they'd recruited Peter Fincham, Griff's friend from Cambridge, to help run their production company Talkback and gain more control of the programme-making process. In negotiations with the BBC for the new run of the sketch show, Smith, Jones and Fincham had a major change in mind.
I went in for a meeting with Mel and Griff, with the controllers of BBC One and Two at the time, Jonathan Powell and Alan Yentob, and we were talking about the future of Smith and Jones and that it was going to change a bit. We were going to drop the word alas from the front of it, and the conversation sort of went on for a while. And then I think it was Mel Smith said, and of course we want to be on BBC One. Now, Gareth Gwenlyn, the head of comedy at the time, who'd set up the meeting and was there, hadn't briefed Alan Yentob and Jonathan Powell that this was going to be said. So there was a sort of dreadful silence in the room, and Alan Yentob looked a bit twitchy and unhappy about this because he was losing a big comedy double act. And Jonathan, who up to then hadn't said much, sort of sprang to life and looked rather pleased. And from that moment on, Smith and Jones became a BBC One rather than a BBC Two proposition.
Now, give us your money. Come on. Come on. Go and get your money.
Come on. Don't muck around. Come on.
Not enough. It's not enough.
Come on, and the jewellery. Come on, let's have it. Let's have it.
Yeah.
Now, what do you want? What do you want?
Return to Crouch End.
We cracked in there with a slightly new format. Nobody ever noticed the changes of the format. I'd spend every series sort of tearing my hair out, trying to basically sort of play around with the way we did this show and how and sort of make new things. And I don't think anybody ever noticed the fact that we did. Just, patchy at its best sort of reaction.
In actual fact, we always liked the idea of doing popular stuff with as many people as possible laughing. And so we thought, well, we're going to have a broader audience here, so let's allow for that.
They were becoming more mainstream. They were getting very good ratings. Their ratings were going up. They went up to, I think, about 10 million plus.
We've got designer shoulder bags, and I'm sorry, but I haven't got a pen. Can I use your phone?
We're basically crowd pleasers. I mean, we really are. I mean, anything for a laugh, as you can see from the programmes. There's the odd bit with some intellectual content, but fundamentally it's make 'em laugh.
Angie?
What?
I found the tortoise.
The Alas Smith and Jones show was a springboard for many successful writers. Andy Hamilton and Guy Jenkin went on to write Drop the Dead Donkey, and David Renwick created One Foot in the Grave. Jimmy Mulville and Rory McGrath wrote and performed in Who Dares Wins, Chelmsford 1, 2, 3, and with Denise O'Donoghue set up their own TV production company, Hat-Trick. Rory, however, still found time to write for Smith and Jones.
There was a time in about series 27 when he got fed up with me and Clive. I think we'd known him too long, so we'd known him since the turn of the century. That's the 18th century, of course. And I think he thought he once described me and Clive as a couple of smart-ass wankers, And I think, and that was one of the nice things he said about us.
After a while, I was making my own programme, so I don't know if I resigned or I was sacked.
Now we come on to meet somebody who I've been dying to meet for at least a day or two, and here he is, Griff Rhys-Jones.
But Clive and Griff made up in a way TV does best, as guests on each other's shows.
Clive moved on. He became too famous to be able to turn up and write with us, so fair enough.
By 1992, Smith and Jones was in its 7th series. Some of the best writers in British comedy had contributed to the show, but they'd also moved on. New talent was needed, and it was discovered in Dublin.
We were watching Smith and Jones, and we realised that there was a
a list of credits of writers that was very long, and it suddenly occurred to us. Of course, they probably take scripts from loads of different people, and that would seem to us to be the perfect show to send some unsolicited stuff and see if they liked any of it.
And Jim Pullen was the script editor, and he rang us up and said, "Yeah, Mel and Griff have seen this and liked it." And then we went in to meet them.
So by this stage, we were getting very excited because we thought, "Wow, this is this might be something."
I think because they were just excited that we were just completely unknown, and from nowhere we got straight in, invited to the top table.
Linehan and Matthews specialised in surreal sketches, and many found their way into Series 7.
Welcome then to Edmonton, Canada, for highlights of today's events. Derek Ridgely in the studio beside me. Good evening, Derek. Now we have Yves Montague of Germany in the hammer throwing. A very big drug user, Derek.
Well, yes, Yves really is drug crazy. He's a big man with a big habit. And here we go. He's into the ball. Yes, he's a great.
The thing is, at that time, the show wasn't that hip, and Arthur and I, we thought we were hip young dudes. So we kind of, thought, well, we'll write them some stuff and we'll get them up to date and stuff, So we were probably a tiny bit arrogant about it, about our place in there. We thought we were going to save the show.
One.
What's he saying there? Wait. Yes, I think it's wank. Gregorio?
See?
You seem to be tagging on a wank there. Can you try it again without wank?
I was not aware of it.
I think there's a wank there.
Nurtured by Talkback, the Irish writers then created their masterpiece. But not for Mel and Griff's company. Father Ted was made by Hat Trick, the company set up by Rory McGrath and Jimmy Mulville, and now Talkback's rival. How did that one get away?
Peter Fincham, who's now the controller of BBC One, who was our partner. I remember had a couple of ideas from them, and he said, "I've passed on the one, but I think the best one is the one we've got." And the one he passed on was Father Ted.
I was talking to Mel one day, and Mel said, and I said, we've done these two sitcoms, and one's with Hat Trick and one's with Talkback. And he says, I described them both, and he said, "I'm glad we're getting a racing driving one."
It's a beautiful day out.
Yes.
Would you like it manual or automatic, Father?
Automatic, I think. It's a nice day. Might as well take it easy.
Fair enough.
Hat Trick may have landed Father Ted, but Linehan and Matthews paid their dues, delivering Big Train, a big hit, for Talkback in 1998. Other Smith & Jones writers also had big success. Robin Driscoll co-wrote Bean, the ultimate disaster movie, directed by Mel Smith, and Rory McGrath found his niche in many series of Talkback's They Think It's All Over. Mel and Griff had been well served by their writing protégés, as they recognise.
No, we worked with some fantastic writers, and I can't say enough about them, really. Bastards.
I think of the number of people who owe their careers to me. It's extraordinary. If only I'd been nicer to them about it, maybe they'd still employ me.
I think Griff always feels that, writers come along and they train them, and then it's like they've done some kind of work experience thing, and then they immediately leave and do their own thing.
I always say to people that writing for Smith & Jones was like going to comedy college for a year.
There's a little bit of you that's a bit like, Mum and Dad watching them totter out and into the world for the first time. There is a bit of that. You kind of think, oh, bless. I'm sure they're going to do well, but now they must leave us.
Smith & Jones ran throughout the 90s on BBC One, with a new series broadcast every other year. By this time, they were in competition with newer sketch shows and sitcoms, many of them made by Talkback. In 1991, Mel and Griff had been named the top entertainers at the British Comedy Awards, but by 1998, after 15 years at the top, there was a question mark over the show's future.
I don't think there is a natural end to a sketch show series. There's no narrative, so it could go on forever. You know, the characters don't die off or anything like that.
We actually, at the end of the series, were being handed sketches where I'd say, well, to the producer, I said to Yoan, well, actually, we've done this. He said, I know it always feels to you, Griff, you're always saying we've done this sort of sketch. And I said, no, we have done this sketch. Somebody has written it down. Off either a folk memory or it's been told to them, or it's been, this is my sketch from 10 years ago, rewritten and sent back into us.
I think that Peter Salmon felt the series had been there long enough. It was time to rest it. A very, very difficult thing to say and do. Most difficult thing to do in comedy. It's as if you're saying to these guys, you're not funny anymore, which isn't the case at all. But the show probably had reached the end of its natural life.
Talkback was sold in the year 2000 for £62 million. Mel Smith continued to work in movies, directing Blackball and High Heels and Lowlives. Back on stage in 2006, he played Winston Churchill in Allegiance. Griff Rhys-Jones's comedy acting flourished in Mine, All Mine before he reinvented himself as a presenter on BBC Two's architectural show Restoration. He was also seen messing about on the river with an old Cambridge chum in Three Men in a Boat. But it's as Smith and Jones that this unlikely duo made their mark on British comedy. And they returned to BBC One in 2006 to reflect on past glories.
Made me very nostalgic for doing more. We always had a very good time working out material and doing it together.
It was a great time to be working because our sense of humour was getting the ratings. When you found something funny and millions of others found it funny too, you just felt on top of the world.
We absolutely owe them everything just because they gave us our break in the world of comedy.
In the period of doing hundreds and hundreds of shows, or whatever, however many shows we did, I think we can safely say we probably initiated every single form of comedy that has ever been subsequently in the British, except for the sort of Dom Joly type. We didn't do any of that.
I'm quite proud to be in the tradition of what you might call, popular double acts. That's certainly good enough for me.
Well, there we are, ladies and gentlemen. What can we say? You've been terrific.
Yes, we've had probably the night of our lives up here tonight, and that's rather depressing when you think about it.
As the tears of laughter dry, the clowns have gone wild, as the curtain starts to fall.
Good night, God bless.
To one and all. As the laughter turns to tears, half an hour can seem like years. Here's a list of cast and crew. Christ alone knows what they do.